So, with the announcement of the 2023 International League for Valorant, we now know that there is going to be the Pacific League in Seoul, Korea. And we've got some great representation of 10 organizations here that will represent the Asian region well. And many of them already have represented the Asian region well, both in Valorant and in other games. Now, here in the article, it says that we would like to field championship caliber teams by drawing on the best talent from every corner of the territory. Now, we know the league's going to be here in Seoul, South Korea, but if we want to take this phrase very literally and go to the literal corner of the world, the arse end of the world, we find ourselves in a place called Australia. And Australia's smaller brother, New Zealand, where there is maybe a couple of players as well. So look, I'm not going to be too unrealistic and say that we're going to have a ton of players go over from Australia. I've seen how a lot of these things work in other esports oftentimes. So I've kind of put together a little bit of a list of players that might be able to go over and potentially play in a franchising league based on how the first couple of years have gone for us domestically down here in Australia. And look, I've got 2 or 3 players initially that I think you could just slot straight into a franchising league team from Australia that are pretty much ready to go. And I'm going to go a little bit into their backgrounds and explain why they might be great candidates after those 3 players, because I really would be surprised to see any more than maybe 3 or 5 players get put into a franchising league from such a small kind of sub-region as Australia. I've got a bunch of other players as well that might have made the list, might be good representatives, might be good candidates, but, I've decided to be very, very picky and only pick a couple. I'll go through some of the other players that could have almost made the list and, go into their backgrounds and list why they might have been a great pick. And then I'll also go through at the end some honourable mentions of players that I might not expect to make the franchising league or anything like that, but I would hope that these are going to be some of the players that we'll see in 2023 playing in whatever domestic circuit we end up with in Australia, maybe playing some off-season tournaments and hopefully getting themselves into a position where they can go and potentially play in Asia, maybe try to grind their way through the open circuit and make a little bit of a name for themselves next year. So the first player I'd recommend for franchising from Australia would be Texta, and to kind of contextualize and understand why he's my number 1 pick, we can go back through his career a little bit and get an idea of what his background is and what he's achieved. So for anyone that's not aware, Texta was a Counter-Strike player before he started playing Valorant, and it's important to note that at the start of this timeline here on Wikipedia in mid-2016, Texta is only 15 years old. So definitely got into playing competitive FPS at a pretty good level, very, very young compared to a lot of other players' trajectories. And look, nothing to really note too much in 2016 until the end of the year, where his team is able to qualify for the Zen League, which is domestic and kind of Asia League between Oz and Asia. We'll get into that a little bit more later on. As we head into 2017, very, very early on here, even less than a year before this timeline starts, Texta already starts to post some good results. He's able to win Season 24 of ECA Premier, which has a international qualifier spot attached to it where an Australian team is able to go overseas. So early on, you could see, he's barely 15, 16 years old. He's able to not only qualify himself for national events, but he's also able to qualify himself for an international event through, an online qualifier kind of situation. And in this domestic national event, I'm not going to go into every event because we'll be here all day, but in this round robin stage, it's all of Australia's 4 best teams at that time, and his team is actually able to come top 2, which is probably not expected. I probably would have expected them to come 4th overall, and they're able to progress to the next stage of the league. As for the international LAN that Texta went to, we can have a little bit of a look at that. You can see, you have a couple of teams from Europe, a couple of teams from North America, as well as a Brazilian and an Australian representative. So for anyone that's familiar with Counter-Strike, you see a lot of familiar names here, some Swedish veteran players mixed in with some new talent. That Godsent team was quite interesting to watch. And then big, Penta, this was a good European mix, couple of North American teams. So Dark-Sided, they're not really expected to do too much at this event. A lot of these players don't have a crazy amount of experience at this point, and they're probably not even really considered to be a top 3 team in Australia? I mean, arguably, maybe they would be, but I think a lot of people would put a fair few other Australian teams ahead of them. So at an event like this, from a small domestic region, teams are not expected to do very much from Australia. But you can see in their group here, they have the same round differential as this Swedish Godsent team, and they barely don't make it through after dropping that last game to Godsent. So a pretty good showing. They're at least able to beat one of the American teams and, do a decent showing for themselves at their first international event. So rest of 2017, Texta, obviously Texta, another Australian player, and that's an age-old thing. They used to play against each other. Absolute nightmare to cast. Texta plays in some other domestic leagues. He plays in the Zen League, which is a bit of a mix of Asian talent as well as Australian teams. You can see all these Korean veterans here. Here you got Rekka, Excurate, obviously Forsaken's brother, Bentet, Rozzo from PSJ. So a lot of players from the Asian region, which a lot of our Australian domestic talent going back into 2017, 18, 19 Counter-Strike was getting mixed up with. As we head through the rest of 2017 here, there's a few domestic events where Texas teams are often losing to some of the better teams in the country. Tainted Minds, Greyhound, Kings, who end up becoming Order. I would say next notable event is probably this ROG Masters APAC event, where Texta goes and plays against, again, Asian teams. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with Counter-Strike, here we have the Japanese team that ends up being the starting point of the Zeta Division team. Again, we have this Indonesian team. Here we've got Stacks, who, for anyone who's familiar with DRX, you also got Lakia there. Some early Korean players who are not part of the 1.6 core. You've got PTC from Full Sense playing on Firepower here. And again, contextualizing this kind of event, yeah, it's an Asian event, so the threshold's a little bit better for an Australian team's performance. But they actually do very well for themselves. They make it all the way to the grand final, and they lose to Firepower, which was an Asian mix. Like I pointed out before, PTC's playing on that. And it's notable to say that because not only do they qualify for the next stage of the event, this is kind of like a mini APAC qualifier, but also Firepower actually ends up winning this whole event. So to the fact that Texas Atletico team is able to play them very close at a mini international event is very, very promising, because like I said, it's only been 2-ish years or something like that of competing for Texta, maybe not even that. Obviously they get knocked out here by Greyhound, which is another one of our Aussie representatives. That would have been a very familiar matchup for those guys. And as we start to head out of 2017, we have a couple of domestic LAN wins. There's a win over Tainted Minds at CGPL. That's a pretty good one. Now we head into 2018, and Texta gets picked up by Chiefs, which is who he plays on for the rest of his career, or the majority of the rest of his career, before he moves over to Valorant. So in 2018, this was kind of the standout year for Texta, I would say. He wins a couple of domestic events. He plays in ESL Pro League Asia. He ends up qualifying for an IEM event, which is in Sydney in 2018. That was the second IEM Sydney. They don't do particularly well there. They get knocked out by both Fnatic and the Koreans MVP PK. But this is where the Chiefs team, they start beating a couple of the better teams in Australia. They beat Order at NZ Champs Season 6. You can see they continue to win some of these smaller domestic events. We have, Premier, where they're often losing to teams like Greyhound, and that'll be a trend that you'll see continue because Greyhound was definitely one of the better teams in the region at this point. They end up qualifying for both WRONSKI and Zowie Extremesland. For anyone who doesn't know Zowie Extremesland, it was the event where the Indian Forsaken got caught cheating. And it was a pretty interesting event. You've got a lot of people who even now are kind of actively involved in Valorant. Mini Zeta, obviously, is Sunny or Zeta, plays in NA, now he's on T1 or whatever. Again, you've got this Japanese mix. You got a lot of the Korean veterans on this team. You got Devi from Paper Rex. And at this event, Chiefs, they don't do super well, but they do actually end up beating this Flash Gaming team, which was pretty nice. So as we head to the WRONSKI event, that's kind of a weird event. That's always like only national lineups, but it was great that they were able to beat Order to qualify. But you need all teams that are only from the same country. And you can see it's an interesting event. You got some really good like Counter-Strike teams, but it's just a little bit of an outlier because obviously you can only bring all players from the same country. So maybe there wouldn't have been some of the best teams in the world at this event, but the fact that Texta is able to play in this environment in the Chiefs team is pretty awesome. It's another great kind of achievement for him. Towards the end of 18, they continue win domestic events. They win another season of ANZ Champs, which is kind of like the gold standard for domestic events in Australia. And that's, of course, on LAN. And as we head into 2019, this is kind of his last season of competition. Doesn't win as many events, but does, again, qualify for the ESEA Global Challenge and IEM Sydney, which I would say would be the standouts. At this IEM Sydney, they do a little bit better, actually. They beat a pretty respectable Vici Gaming team, which is obviously this Chinese team that's had good results for quite a while. And then they also take a map off Fnatic here in the lower bracket round 2, a game of Dust 2 that was a pretty good one. But ultimately, for Australian teams at events like this, you do tend to kind of get outclassed, unfortunately. Then again, at this Global Challenge event, they play Furia, who end up winning the whole event. And unfortunately, Furia knocks them out in the group stage, despite the fact that they're playing with their coach. But again, you know, Chiefs don't do nothing at this event. They beat one of the NA representatives, which I think this is actually a South African team at the time or something like that, who ended up coming top 3 in NA Premier. So not too bad of a result there, but obviously they only come 5th, 6th. And as we head towards the end of 2019, this is where, you know, it's just domestic events. He's always kind of coming top 4. But, you know, obviously Valorant is kind of on the horizon. And Texta is one of these players who has a bit of incentive to move over, which is something I'll discuss like at the end of this. But at least for domestic competition, to kind of sum up his Counter-Strike career, I mean, online, he comes first twice, he comes second 5 times, and he comes top 4 8 times. For online international qualifiers, he wins one of them, he comes second twice, and he comes top 4 5 times. So decent results online, but the more impressive results are often on LAN for Texta, where at, you know, these kind of tier 1 lands in Australia, like your ANZ Champs, he wins 3 of them, he comes second once, and he comes top 4 twice. And at, you know, the tier 2 lands like your CGPLs or your LPL invitationals and things like that, he wins 3 of them, he comes second once, and he comes top 4 twice. And at the LAN international qualifiers, he comes first 3 times. So he wins himself a lot of lands despite being very, very young, despite being only, you know, between the ages of like 15 and 19 across his whole Counter-Strike career. He achieves a lot for himself, which is quite impressive to see. So we see the Counter-Strike timeline kind of die towards the end of 2019, and obviously that's because Valorant is on the horizon, and as I'll get into a little bit later, Texta has a bit of an incentive to change over from Counter-Strike into Valorant, and obviously it's a new and exciting game. So for 2020, the first year of competition here domestically in Australia, Texta plays very, very early on, and he's already on a top 2 team, which is, you know, team launch. They end up becoming Order, and they have this good rivalry in the first year with Exo Clan, which is, you know, another one of those early Australian cores that does very well for themselves, and obviously they went on to go play overseas in NA as Sonics. But you can see in 2020, just to briefly summarize, he wins both of the not circuit events, so both of the independent events that were organized by other people. So he wins the Order event, and he wins the Chiefs event, the Mex Invitational. But when it comes to the actual circuit events, the Riot associated events, at both of them, they end up coming second to EXO in 0-3 scorelines. As we head into 2020, though, this is where the EXO team goes on to play in NA. They're no longer really involved in the domestic Australian scene. So Texta's team, you know, towards the end of 2020 does get picked up by Order, which is obviously one of the biggest orgs for the last couple of years in Australia, and obviously was kind of the household name in Valorant until things happened. Not going to cover that, or we'll be here all day. But at the start of 2021, Order's already doing quite well for themselves. In the stage 1 of the VOT, they win. They get pushed by Mindfreak a little bit, but they win a pretty clean VOT there and get themselves some nice circuit points. Then we have the Order Nova Invitational. They also win that, getting pushed by Mindfreak a little bit, but I'd say still winning a pretty nice event for themselves there. As we head into stage 2, though, they have a little bit of a hiccup where They do actually get upset in back-to-back series by Nozz's wildcard. And they're not particularly close series either. Like, as you can see here, upper bracket game, wildcard kind of smacks them on bind, and Ascent is a pretty clean win for them as well. The only map Order's able to win is this 13-11, and then a very, very clean grand final from wildcard. So outside of that one, you can see Order has a really good year. They go on to win Rising Heroes. They go on to win Stage 3 very, very cleanly. And then in the 2021 Championship, which was finally the overseas qualifier for the NALCQ, they win a very, very clean event. They do drop 2 maps to Peace in the grand final, but that was a bit of a weird grand final. Like, I don't think that Peace was necessarily expected to win Breeze. I think that was one of Order's best maps. And honestly, wouldn't have been surprised to see that this map would be a 3-0. But when Bind ends up coming out, obviously you have a little bit of a easier time for Peace to win a map, and then we have a very, very close map. I was surprised Peace was actually able to push Order this much, because I don't remember this being such a close grand final. And at the end of the day, the grand final didn't have a great bearing, because obviously this was the event where 2 NALCQ spots were on offer. But look, end of the day, Order still picked it up, and they won pretty much everything in 2021 outside of VOT Stage 2. So as we head into 2022, obviously they didn't get the chance to go over the NALCQ, and I'll go over that in a minute, or maybe even when I talk about a different player. As we go into 2022, we have Oceania Tour Stage 1, where Order are one of the invited teams. They play very, very few maps. In fact, a whole bunch of teams end up forfeiting to them in the regular stage of the tournament. And they, compared to some of the other teams, played like half the maps. They might have played like 11 maps or something in the regular stage of the tournament. They don't really get a whole lot of game time. And actually, they get upset in pretty shocking fashion by Bonkers in the grand final. Which was a kind of out there result for most of the people that followed the scene. Order definitely being the favourites and having a pretty dominant display through the majority of this tournament. So that's a bit of a missed opportunity for Texta and Order. But as we head into Stage 2, they make some roster changes and they win that. And in Stage 3, you can see them win again, both times over Bobo, who is a pretty clear number 2 in the region. If we have a look at some of these APAC events, this initial APAC event, which is the first time the Order goes overseas, they end up in a group with, I believe it was Boom, PaperX, Oasis. So pretty tough group, honestly. And they still end up with a +4 round differential because they do such a good job of dispatching Oasis, which I think is one of the Filipino teams. But PaperX, obviously one of the best teams in the region. And Boom, in general, I think Indonesian teams definitely set the standard in my mind for these Southeast Asia regions. Like, that is a very, very... They just have so much depth in terms of how many teams are good in that region. And in general, you'll see Indonesian teams ruining the hopes of AU is a bit of a trend across pretty much every single stage of VCT APAC. As far as this APAC Last Chance qualifier goes, this is a much better event for Order. And they do fairly well for themselves, ending up beating Fancy, losing a pretty cut and dry series again to another strong Indonesian team against Onyx. And they go down to the lower bracket. They beat the Vietnamese team really, really one-sidedly. And against Secret, they win one really good map and then lose a very, very close one on Breeze. So unfortunate that they go out in the lower bracket quarters there, but they definitely do a pretty good showing for themselves. And as far as Texta is concerned, in his whole Valorant career, he is very, very clearly on the best team, if not on a top 2 team that is either getting upset or has a very, very close rivalry as far as 2020 is concerned with EXO. So to kind of summarize his Valorant career, domestically, he came first 9 times, he came second 4 times, and he qualified for 3 international events, but only attended 2 due to the fact that the NALCQ ended up being a bit of a shit show. To summarize his whole career, I mean, his Counter-Strike career shows how much experience he has. He's still incredibly competitive despite the fact that he had a VAC ban. And that would make it very, very hard for him to get onto a lot of the better teams and for some people to team with him, because a lot of the time some of the other Australian players would want to make teams that would go to the Asia Minor, and that was not something that Texta was able to do. So I feel like if he didn't have that back status, he probably would have gotten on better teams and probably even had a better Counter-Strike career and not have had to switch to Valorant, but that's the way that it ended up. He was the youngest player to compete at the top level of CS domestically here in Australia, and he was winning LANs and playing very well statistically, if not being the MVP of some of these events at like 15 or 16 years old, which is insane. Texta would pretty much only lose to some of the best cores in OCS, so Order, Greyhound, Tainted Minds, and he played 8 at international events. I'm going to say international because mostly we're talking about Asia events. We're talking about IEMs that are in Sydney, have an easier qualification process for the Australian teams a lot of the time. So, you know, most people would associate international events in CS with European events, I would say, but still, they are international events and they're still really good experience. Before he's 18 or 19, he plays 8 of those, so that's pretty massive. I think heading into Valorant, he's kind of reinvented himself and his playstyle. He went from being an aggressive rifler that put up a lot of frags in Counter-Strike to being a bit more of a supportive player in Valorant, playing Initiator, playing Controller and things like that, and still putting up above average numbers in his role consistently and having a lot of impact. He's always had a great ability to kind of clutch and make plays, even when he's playing, you know, Controller or Initiator or he's in-game leading his team. And he's always been at the top of the domestic scene. You know, if you're going to make any kind of results happen in Oceanic Valorant, you usually will have to beat whatever team Texta was playing on. So it's kind of insane that someone like Texta has achieved so much in his career. And you can see he's only 21 years old, like born after 2000. He's still got plenty more years left in him. And that's what makes him, I think, the best possible candidate to pick up for the franchise league from our region, because not only is he incredibly skilled, but he also has a ton of experience for his age. So the next player I would recommend to pick up for franchising from Australia is, of course, rDeeW. Looking here at his career on Wikipedia, look, 2020, he plays for a couple of teams that do all right, but there's no real standout results as such. So, look, we'll start out here in 2021, where he begins to play on Wildcard, and that's what I associate with him early on. Wildcard, obviously, a team that has, as you'll see, a very good ceiling and is always considered to be one of the better teams in the country. However, sometimes they had a tendency to bomb tournaments inexplicably. We'll start out here on Stage 1 Finals, which is a perfect example here early on in 2021. They get upset and come 5th to 8th against Straight Out of the Zoo in a tournament where you would expect them to probably do a little bit better for themselves. Here in Autonova Invitational, they get grouped. So first couple of months of 2021 for rDeeW on Wildcard, they don't go super fantastic. However, his fortunes will very quickly turn around, as his team is always a pretty good team. And it's just about whether they're kind of performing on the day, where you look here at Stage 2 Finals, and rDeeW's wildcard team is able to upset Order, which is considered by far to be the best team in the country, in back-to-back series, as I covered in Texta's part. Those were these two series here. And that was a very, very solid performance for them. And I think rDeeW was a very, very critical part of that upset, along with, you know, Ninim and Nozz IGLing. And I think SWERL did quite well as well. I mean, in general, their team was very well rounded. Rising Heroes, this is an off-circuit tournament that I showed before. And this is a 3-1 in favor of Order. But this grand final was like nail-bitingly close. Like... I remember, going the distance every single map, like OT, and then 13-11, and Order had a map advantage as well in this grand final, so really couldn't separate these two teams. Wildcard at that time, middle of 2021, were a very, very good team, and rDeeW was a key part of that. As we head towards the last part of the year, as I covered in Texas part, 2021 VOT Championship, as well as Stage 3 Finals. Finals still a bit more of a seeding event, but this is the first signs that Wildcard are having some issues against Peace, where they dropped this series against Peace here and don't do as well as you might expect them to. And unfortunately, that trend continues heading into VOT Oceania to a championship, which I think was a bit of a close event. It was hard to say who was going to be the second slot. Everyone knew that Order was going to be the first team to go through to the NALCQ, but the second slot was really up for grabs. But at least for me, everyone had their opinions, but I actually really expected Wildcard to be the team to actually go in towards that second slot in NALCQ, especially after their performance in the middle of the year, and they showed already the capacity to beat Order. I thought that they were going to be the ones to do it, but as you can see, they end up coming fourth behind both Bliss and Peace, and not doing well for themselves. And I remember that tournament being a weird situation where, very strangely, a lot of the players on Wildcard ended up switching roles. Almost everyone on the team ended up switching roles to something that they weren't really excelling at when we were in this middle part of the year, and it just did not work out for them at all. They ended up, unfortunately, getting knocked out of that tournament when I felt like they were favourites to go to NALCQ. As we head into 2022, we have rDeeW playing for X Wildcard at the start of the year, and as I said, sometimes some really weird results happen, and they actually didn't even qualify for VO2 Stage 1. They got knocked out in the open qualifier after losing to, they lost to Fun Crew, which was a pretty good mixed team at that time, to be fair. And they also lost to Honey Badgers, which ended up being a team that was pretty decent in the Oceania Tour circuit. They were usually like around a fit 6 team though, not like a crazy good top 4 team, but just a decent team. So, there was almost going to be a situation where rDeeW doesn't end up playing in VOT Stage 1 at all, but this is where he actually gets picked up by the Bonkers team, who ends up upsetting Order to be able to qualify for the first time an Australian team ends up going into APAC Challenges. And this was a shock upset. rDeeW was a very, very big part about why they were able to upset here, along with the rest of the team. They all definitely played their own part and their own role in it. But rDeeW, through both the middle of 2021 and the start of 2022, very clearly showed that he was the key to, or at least a key component to beating Order, which was our country's best team for the longest time, and probably most people would agree still is, although who the hell knows what's happening at this point. So even after qualifying for that APAC Challenges Stage 1 event, I think the writing was pretty much on the wall at that event that rDeeW was likely going to be going to Order. And I actually had the pleasure of coaching the Bonkers team at this event, so I remember this event quite vividly. And unfortunately, Bonkers doesn't end up making it through the group stage with a -4 round differential. They destroy Fancy in the losers bracket game. They played PSJ first. PSJ ends up losing the first map, but Bonkers gets stomped the next 2. And then in the rematch against PSJ, who obviously lose to Paper Rex, Bonkers unfortunately loses what I would kind of characterize as an unlosable game. They really should have been able to take out PSJ in this group, but I think nerves and pressure ended up getting to them. I think they had like a 10-4 lead on the second map of Fracture when they were already up 1-0, and unfortunately that ended up being a game that didn't go their way. And then in that third map, they were even leading and they were in a good position, and I remember a bunch of post plants with garbled communication, and unfortunately they didn't end up making it out of groups, and that's just the way that history is wrote. But for anyone that goes back and watches this VOD, if it even is there, because I know sometimes these Valorant VODs can be hard to find, this game I felt like was a very, very big missed opportunity, unfortunately. And maybe that's because I was coaching and I suck, but who knows. But as we head into Stage 2, like I said, the writing was already on the wall for rDeeW. As you often see in the domestic leagues in smaller regions, if you've got one very dominant team and there's one player that gives them trouble, a lot of the time that player will end up joining them. They'll end up poaching them, and that was the case here. rDeeW goes on to play for Order and goes on to play in APAC Stage 2 and LCQ and win every tournament very, very cleanly for the rest of the year, beating Bobo both times. In Stage 2 challenges, same as Texta, they end up getting grouped by Boom. And in this event, they end up losing to Secret. So, look, rDeeW, a pretty good career outside of a couple of bad, results, particularly on Wildcard, where they would just inexplicably bomb out of tournaments, as well as getting, the other end of that karma, maybe. Stage 1, they didn't make it out of the open qualifier, and then he ends up winning the whole event. So, sometimes it can kind of be like that. Look, I think rDeeW is a great candidate to pick up for franchising because he's definitely been one of our country's best players for a long time. He's got so much impact on the lurk play. He's obviously quite famous for playing that Sentinel role initially, but now he's really fleshed out his agent pool and he can play a lot of different agents. He's known for being very clutch. He's known for making a lot of big impact plays. And he's known for being very passionate about the game. This event, attending APAC Stage 1 challenges, he just... Before he got on the flight, he got an operation on his foot. And to take the flight, he was advised not to take the plane, not to attend this event at all by all of his doctors. And because they were worried about him getting a blood clot. But he said, there's no way I'm missing this event. Literally, to some, percentage chance, risks his life by going on a plane trip over to Thailand. Just takes some blood thinners. Literally on the first day of the event, he stacks it on his crutches and ends up opening up his stitches. And he's in pain this whole event, but he still plays phenomenal Valorant. So this is a player that, he has a lot of talent. He's got the results to back him. He's a player that's probably well-known, at least well-known in Asia after some of these APAC events. And he's got the passion, so definitely someone worth picking up on a franchising team and one of the standout players from our region. So the last player I would regard as a must pick up from Oceania to go into franchising is going to be the Jet One Trick hard carry WRONSKI. Looking at his career here on Wikipedia, 2020, he's playing a little bit for a couple of teams, nothing to really note too much. As we head into 2021, he begins to play for, one of these fun crew mixes, as well as playing for Team Bliss. Now, these are teams that are often kind of on the periphery, as you can see. They're in the top, 6 to 8 couple of teams. You see a lot of these kind of results where, outside of this event, which is probably considered to be a tier 2 event, these teams that WRONSKI is playing on are often coming somewhere between 4th and 6th. But the thing that's notable about WRONSKI is even in this period, he was known for being a really standout player statistically. So even if we look at Stage 2, for example, here, where his team end up coming 5th and 6th, if we take a look at the stats here, WRONSKI is still very, very high up there. 274 ACS, 3rd overall. Should probably change that, actually. He's 1st overall because we don't want to keep those, 40, 50 ACS, 40, 50 rounds rather played. It's not really super relevant. I'd rather look at who actually made it a little bit deeper in the tournament and played a reasonable amount of rounds. So you can see WRONSKI, 1st overall for Bliss, 274 ACS, and insane FKPR, which is first kills. For anyone who's not familiar with this rating system on VLR, let me tell you about the colors of the rainbow. So if things are violet or purple, usually it's indicative of a very, very good or a very, very high statistic overall compared to the rest of the field. So very high in first kills, very high in ACS, which is something that you will see is very, very characteristic of WRONSKI's performances. Rising Heroes, for example, again, another tournament where WRONSKI's team does not necessarily play particularly well. And let's take a look. He is 1st overall in statistics again. 270 ACS, again, very high first kill. So even on some of these, not super good teams, he's doing quite well for himself. As we head into the second part of the year, though, about the halfway point, WRONSKI ends up joining this Peace lineup, who I think realistically are, again, maybe slightly better or maybe around the same level as a Bliss. Bliss keeps performing at around this same level without WRONSKI even for pretty much the rest of the year. But it's on Peace where WRONSKI starts to make some notable results happen. So stage 3 finals, they end up coming second to Order, upsetting a couple of teams along the way, and WRONSKI is a big component of that, having a really, really good hard carry performance on the jet a lot of the time. And again here at the 2021 championship, as we've highlighted before, Peace run the gauntlet. He ends up beating both Wildcard in a reasonably close series, and ends up beating his old team, Bliss, with some really, really big kind of stomp wins on the last 2 maps in favor of Peace there, and actually ends up giving Order a lot of trouble here in the last event of the year, and gets himself the MVP in the final, and I would probably say the MVP of the whole event as well, because in this event he ends up finishing 3rd overall in statistics, and does quite well for himself. Obviously Autumn from Order up there as well, but again, first kills are pretty good. First deaths, that's going to be a trend for WRONSKI, because he is naturally a very aggressive player. He's going to be very hit or miss in terms of whether he's getting you the opening kill or getting opening killed himself. But you can see the results there for Peace speak for themselves, and WRONSKI ends up nabbing himself a spot in the NA/LCQ. Now, unfortunately, they don't make it to the NA/LCQ because, unfortunately, as WRONSKI would learn, I believe when he was already traveling from Tasmania over to Sydney on a domestic flight, as he touches down in Sydney, the domestic flight, his team and I think Order as well are informed that, unfortunately, the Oceanic representatives will not be able to go over and participate in the NA/LCQ. So that's obviously going to be a bit of a disappointment for everyone involved at the end of 2021. But WRONSKI, nonetheless, will continue into 2022, where he begins actually on Mindfreak, gets picked up by a Mindfreak core that was playing actively in all of those tournaments last year as well. So as we look at stage 1, again, here's another 5th place in a domestic event for WRONSKI. But look at the statistics here, and again, on Mindfreak, he is up the top of the statistics for the whole tournament. He's up the top of the first kills for the whole tournament. And he's almost 1 kill per round compared to the rest of the field, which is still quite damn high, despite the fact that he might have played a whole lot less rounds than some of the other boys, for not making it as deep. And as we discussed in some of the other parts, obviously, Order getting upset in... he really pushed Order at the end of that last year, like I said, and Order ended up getting upset by Bonkers in stage 1. They decided to make some roster changes, and I think that WRONSKI and obviously rDeeW were kind of natural pickups for them. So they end up picking up WRONSKI heading into stage 2 of Oceania Tour 2022, and that's where things tend to get pretty insane from this point on. You look at the statistics for WRONSKI. This is an insane one, by the way. Like, guys, 260 rounds. He's got 280 ACS. He's got over 1 KPR, and he's got 0.25 first kill per round, and a 40% clutch rate. He wins 40% of his clutches. I'm not sure, 6 out of 16. So he wasn't put into that many clutch positions compared to some of the other guys, because obviously I would imagine Order's winning most of their rounds. They probably don't need to clutch that many rounds, but also they're not having to play as many rounds because they're winning a lot of their games quite handily. But of course, Order go on to win stage 2 and stage 3, as kind of summarized in those other games. Here's another one where WRONSKI does quite well for himself, second only to Dragon, who was another pretty good player domestically, but obviously didn't get the chance to go overseas as much. So look, here he goes to APAC Stage 2 Challenges, where they, like I said before, lose to Boom. APAC LCQ, where they lose to Secret. I think that WRONSKI probably didn't necessarily play to his potential when he went overseas, but if you look at the statistics for some of those events over in the APAC Stage 2 and APAC LCQ, I don't think that he played terribly. Like, it's not like his statistics absolutely bombed, but I don't remember him having as many crazy games as he has definitely had domestically, and as many highlight plays as he had domestically. However, if you're a team in franchising and you're looking for a young player with a whole lot of talent who you need to play a duelist role and deliver some crazy impact games, to go out there and be naturally aggressive and try and take control of the game, then WRONSKI is probably the best candidate that we have to offer here domestically in Oceania, and I would love to see him get a shot on a pretty good team in franchising. So as I said before, with the formatting of this video, I've gone through my my top 3 picks. Now I'm going to go and mention a whole lot of people who would definitely be good picks as well, but due to the nature of how other regions picking up people from Oceania have gone in other esports titles, I'd be surprised to see more than a couple. But here are some other really, really good picks. First of all, I'm going to start with the EXO core, who I'll take it from Plix's perspective, but this goes for most of them. As I stated before, they had a great year in 2020, arguably the best team, and definitely the best team in circuit events, winning against Order 3-0 in both Rise of Valor and First Strike. Then they win all of the qualifiers for VOT Stage 1, but that's when they get picked up to go over to North America and try to get into the VCT, where they do pretty good in some Tier 2 events, a lot of these NSG events. However, unfortunately, through a lot of the qualifiers, they end up not being able to make it, despite having some good maps here and there and being able to play a lot of the, I would say, Tier 2 NA teams to a pretty decent level. You can see, obviously, here they get knocked out by Sentinels, they get knocked out by TSM. This one, Stage 3 Challenges 1, knocked out by Sentinels again. Open quals this time, get knocked out by Ghost Gaming. So throughout the whole year, you can see they are very much playing these Tier 2 NA events and fighting themselves, some wins, some second places, playing against a lot of, pretty decent teams in the Tier 2 of North America. But when it comes to making it into the VCT, they unfortunately just don't have quite what it takes to run the gauntlet, despite getting into the top 16. So, a pretty decent level in North America. At least for Plix, I think he's the only player from that core of players that ended up coming back and playing a little bit in the VOT. You can see in Stage 2 here, they end up losing to Bonkers, which was a different Bonkers by that point, but they actually had a bit of an underwhelming run in Stage 2. Despite that, though, Plix played quite well statistically. So as far as the EXO core goes, I dare say that a lot of those guys would be great candidates. But the reality is that Iron and Crunchy at least don't play in the Oceanic scene and haven't for almost 2 years. Dizzy, I'm not really sure what's going on with him. Plix is obviously someone that's played a little bit, like I said, in the VOT, but he would be a great candidate. And I felt like throughout a lot of, particularly the early stage and a lot of these good games that they showcased in the VCT qualifiers, I felt like Plix was kind of the standout. And as far as Bob goes, I know they are doing quite well in the Game Changers circuit, so probably no real incentive for them to go anywhere. Next player who would, of course, be a totally valid choice for a top 3 candidate is going to be Disco. So early on in 2020, you can see even before he gets his spot on Order, he places quite well in some of the early tournaments, ROV, and then by the time Mex runs around and First Strike happens, he's already gone on towards Order. But he played quite well playing for Ground Zero in this tournament, if I remember correctly, which is probably what got him scouted for Order and picked up. And of course, along with Texta and the rest of the OG Order core, you can see he has the same results. The only thing that I'd like to really mention about him, outside of his dominant domestic results and the fact that he has, of course, been overseas a similar amount of times, is that he's been one of the most consistent players domestically. I remember, he's had to maybe change up his role here or there. You've definitely seen him as the ultimate flex player. Either he's picking up that secondary duelist, or maybe he's going on to something like a Breach or a Sky or something like that. Sometimes even picking up a Sentinel role. And he's still putting up very, very good numbers consistently. When he's gone overseas, he's still playing pretty decently well. In LCQ in particular, he played quite well. Stage 2, a little bit more average, but Order, as you can see, didn't particularly do as well in that tournament and didn't make it out of groups. So I think Disco, a very good candidate to be picked up as well. But obviously have to be a little bit more picky and just pick a couple of players, because I would be very surprised if more than 3 to 5 get picked up. So the next player that is, of course, worth mentioning is going to be Maple. I mean, we're just covering everyone in order at this point, but so has been their domestic domination that it's hard to go past anyone on the roster. He didn't go into order as quickly as some of the other guys. You can see early on in 2021, he starts out playing for Demon, which was a bit of a mixed team. And I think he was also filling in for some other teams, maybe in Rising Heroes or Nova Invitational, but for some reason they haven't got this listed on Liquipedia. But I remember him playing quite well statistically in at least one of those events. Now, on some of these other rosters, he was someone that was playing a bit more of a duelist role, and you would see him right up the top of the stats, top 5, 6 in terms of the stats, playing for Demon or playing on whatever mixed team he was playing his trade in. As he moved on to Order, though, he was, I believe, the replacement for Signed. And they move him into playing an initiator role. He spent a lot of time grinding and learning how to play Sova and learning how to play some of the other agents. And he does quite well, despite, playing a role that's not really known for fragging prowess. Maple not only finishes very consistently in the top 10, 15 players in terms of the statistics, there's even some events where he's standout in terms of statistics, maybe even being top 5, even on an initiator role. But also showcasing a pretty decent clutch percentage in a lot of these domestic events for Order. And even when he goes overseas to APAC Stage 2 Challenges and to APAC LCQ, Maple's stats basically don't really move. He is very, very consistent. His performance does not dip really when he goes overseas internationally, at least in terms of the statistics. And it's worth mentioning as well that he is one of these players who is in a bit better of a position in Australia, as usually in other games like Counter-Strike, for example, being a player from Western Australia, the other side of the coast to which most Australian people live, is a bit of a disadvantage. In Valorant, I actually perceive being from Perth as maybe even being an advantage, as Maple's been able to ping quite well to Singapore and play against a lot of the Southeast Asian players on ranked and things like that. It's obviously a bit better of a practice environment. Some of our domestic Oceanic teams, due to the state and the nature of practice here in Oceania, will play against some of those Southeast Asian teams. So that's where having a player from Western Australia can really be a big boon, because you're not going to get affected as much as players from Sydney who might have to play on 100 ping. You're basically playing on 60 ping, 40 to 60 ping, whether you're playing a Sydney server or whether you're playing a Singapore server. So Maple there being a good candidate, because not only can he play Southeast Asia ranked, but also, if he wanted to trial for a team that was based in Southeast Asia and might be playing in the Pacific League, he can pretty much showcase a decent level of performance playing from home in the tryouts, and you can get a pretty good idea of what you're going to get without any real big ping disadvantage. So the next player in my mind who's worth mentioning as we now start to move outside of the Order core in domestic Oceanic Valorant is going to be Nozz. I almost put him in the top of the list just due to maybe my own inherent personal bias. Taking a look at his career here, 2020, he's playing quite actively. He's playing in Direwolves, he's playing in Gravitas, which are decent teams, top 8 teams in some of these initial tournaments. Then, similar to some of the other players that we've covered, he goes on to in-game lead for Wildcard and be a key component of their team. For some reason here, Liquipedia is broken, so as I said in some of the other parts, Wildcard is a team that went on to upset Order in the middle of 2021, and I'd say Nozz was a pretty big part of that. If you look here, we'll hop over to VLR. Here we have the upper finals of VOT Stage 2, where Wildcard is able to 2-1 Order in pretty clean series, I have to say. 13-11 for Order, and then 2 really, really good games out of Wildcard. Bind in particular was a bit of a slap. And the thing that I really liked about this wildcard team, obviously, is the fact that, they had this trio of players that was playing really well, but their overall structure was really good. And you have to contribute some of that preparation and some of that organization from Nozz and his ability to in-game lead. And of course, as we head into the grand final, they were also able to best order and win stage 2, with Nozz, I believe, doing the in-game leading. And then over here at Rising Heroes, again, a very, very close grand final with a map advantage, which all went to OTs. This was an absolute barn burner, and I believe Nozz, again, doing some of the in-game leading there. So he's a player that is definitely a great in-game leading candidate. As we head into 2022, like I said, his ex-wildcard team gets knocked out in Stage 1 open quals. And that feels like a death sentence if you're a Valorant player domestically in Oceania. But actually, that might end up being one of the better things that happened to Nozz in his career, because due to the roster lock rules, I believe, in VOT, I don't think you were allowed to pick up players from other teams who had already competed in the VOT to represent your team in VCT. So Nozz was actually one of the players that did not play in Stage 1 of VOT, but was actually, considered to be a good player in the region. And as such, he gets picked up to play for Bonkers in VCT 2022 APAC Stage 1 as a stand-in due to the fact that their main duelist player couldn't get his passport organized. And even though he has to completely change up his role and his play style, he plays very, very well. I had the pleasure of coaching him while he was over there. And what I will say about Nozz is he's got the best communication I've ever heard from any player, even from my time playing a bit of tactical FPS back in Counter-Strike and coaching a couple of teams. I've never heard a player with better communication. I've never seen a player with a better mentality and a better work ethic. He is fantastic at playing a lot of the field roles. He's got in-game leading potential. And I really see him as probably the best glue guy that we have domestically in Oceania. Obviously, I haven't had the chance to work with some of the other guys from the Order Corps, but I really rate Nozz very highly, because I think that not only in terms of what he brings to the team in terms of preparation, but he's virtually untiltable, at least in the games that I got to coach for him. I've literally seen him run entry frag as a Neon out of toilets on bind and go 0 for 10. And after the 10th round of getting shot in the face, running through a smoke, he's still keen to find out what the call is. He's still keen to get in there. So a player with a very, very good mentality, and a player who would be an asset to any team, not only in terms of the preparation level that he brings, his understanding of the macro aspects of the game, of comps, great at doing his research, doing his VOD watching, which contributed greatly to a lot of his team's ability to play structurally very, very well, not only on Wildcard, but also as after he stands in for Bonkers, he goes on to play for the clear number 2 team in the region for the rest of 2022, which is Bobo. Unfortunately, they can't beat Order, but they do very well for themselves for the rest of the year. And every team that Nozz has been a part of, I have seen the effect of it in terms of their structure, in terms of their utility, and in terms of the results as well. To it a little bit, but fuck it, it's my video. And at the end of the day, I do actually value people who take on the mantle of the in-game leader role and definitely wear it and throughout the majority of their career. And I think this man's a perfect example of it. So we're going to go through Minimise's career here. You can see that's a lot of the same logo. For a long time, he's playing under Nebula, which has its various rosters. They are often anywhere between like a top 32 team initially or top 16 kind of team into, I would say by the end of 2021, they've made roster changes and they've kind of improved themselves to the point where they're kind of becoming a top 5, 6 kind of team. They may be playing some closer games against some of the top 4 teams as well. But really where things start to get interesting is, of course, when we head towards the end of 2021 and he departs from this Nebula team. He then goes on to form this mixed team of NerdNext, which is basically the foundational part of Bonkers, who, as you can see in Stage 1 here, do end up upsetting Order and taking a spot over at VCT APAC Stage 1 Challenges. And I had the pleasure of coaching Minimise a couple of times, but particularly over in Thailand in APAC Stage 1, I kind of realized why he's such a valuable asset to any team. And I think it's because he probably contributed greatly to their ability to actually get this upset win over Order. He's very, very good at being able to prepare for teams, to be able to make game plans. And his style of Valorant is very much based on, trying to anti-strat, trying to counter, but also, being very, very creative with the comps. He's always a player who's watching the other regions, who's looking towards the other regions for inspiration. And I felt like while the majority of Oceania was still maybe playing a bit more of a rigid meta, maybe even playing double duelists, I think Minimise's unique approach to the game and inspiration from other regions was a big reason why his teams were always able to punch above their weight in terms of what personnel they had. I felt like these Nebula teams often did not have, a stacked roster by any means, but they would always put up some decent results considering who was playing on the team. This Bonkers team was never expected to win Stage 1, and he was able to put together a solid roster and be able to do it, even with, a couple of experienced players and, tixx, who was a very inexperienced player, even Minimise, pretty inexperienced player at that time. And just in general, you can see he's even got a little bit of experience as he's a player from WA, he's a player from Perth, in playing in the Southeast Asian scene. So he's someone that definitely plays a lot of SCA ranked and even scrims with SCA teams from now and then, and definitely likes to draw inspiration for from a lot of sources. By the end of the year, he's actually playing on Rain here in 2022. And again, Rain is a team where I feel like for the roster that they put together, this roster definitely punched above its weight and was able to play some close series and play better on a short time period, due to the fact that they were able to pick up Minimise and kind of implement somewhat of a system or some of his approaches to Valorant. So I think in terms of someone that might get picked up for franchising, it might be a little bit of a stretch because I'm not sure that his results necessarily warrant it, but he's definitely a player that I could see going forward in the future and maybe in-game leading a team that could do quite well domestically and maybe even try to, grind their way through the open circuit into that kind of a position in the future. So definitely someone to keep your eye on. So next up is tixx, obviously being part of the Bonkers team that upset Order to go over to VCT APAC Stage 1 challenges. The reason why I picked tixx is due to just his meteoric rise in the scene. He doesn't even have a Liquipedia page, but at least in terms of how many seasons he played, early on he isn't even getting out of open qualifiers, playing on smaller teams. He's playing the Tier 2 events in Australia. The first time that tixx here at the start of 2022 makes it onto a team that is good enough to get into VOT, he wins the whole thing. And I don't know if I've ever seen a player domestically play whatever our circuit is, whether it be going back to Counter-Strike and talking about things like ANZ Champs or something like that, or whether it be here in Valorant talking about VOT. I'm not sure I've ever seen a player domestically qualify for his first tournament in terms of our domestic circuit and then go on and win the whole thing. So VOT Stage 1, tixx was able to be a critical part of the Bonkers team that ends up taking down Order. And when he goes over to VCT APAC Stage 1, he actually ends up being, I would say, the best player on Bonkers, to be honest. Some people might say that rDeeW was kind of the player that everyone was talking about. I'm not sure where he ended up going in the statistics, but I'm pretty sure tixx was the highest statistic player, at least out of the Aussies. And you can see, it's not too bad for a player who plays controller. He usually outputs quite good statistics in terms of frags, in terms of clutches, and in terms of impact as well. I think his main skill that from when I got to coach him for a very, very short time over in Thailand was he was very, very good at multi-fragging and holding down a site, and very, very good at making plays, despite the fact that he was kind of put into that controller role. So I think tixx, the reason why I'd put him, or why I would almost put him on the list, is just due to the fact that he's very, very young and he's very, very inexperienced in terms of tactical FPS and playing competitively, but he's already been able to achieve, some international opportunities much faster than I've ever seen anybody able to do. So, he's done pretty well for himself in a short amount of time. So last player we're going to take a little bit more of a close look at is going to be Signed. Now, I didn't follow the Overwatch scene in general too much, and definitely not domestically. So thanks to Avril and Smash for giving me a little bit of insight as to what Signed achieved in his Overwatch career before he moved over to Valorant. I'm not going to go into the detailed results of every tournament because I wouldn't be able to contextualize it properly, but as far as I understand it, 2018, he's a pretty decent player. You can see he's playing on like top 4 teams. Even playing for Order there. As we move into 2019, I think Signed is considered to be the best in his role. And you can see he wins both Overwatch Contenders Season 1, which was a LAN at IEM Sydney. And then he goes overseas to represent Australia in the APAC event. But unfortunately, as far as Overwatch goes, the teams from APAC a lot of the time are going to be very, very solid teams. We're talking about the Korean and the Chinese teams, I'm assuming. So that's going to be probably a pretty hard event for most Australian teams to contend in when you've got a lot of the world-class teams there. After that, later on in 2019, he again wins the second season of Contenders, which I believe was at MEO. So another big LAN to be winning there. And even into halfway through 2020, as Valorant is kind of being rumored a little bit, you see him playing a little bit. Here you can see he came second in that last season of Contenders in, June of 2020. So a pretty decent Overwatch career, and one of the only players who really brings that level of experience into Valorant, I would say, outside of maybe Texta and a few of the other players who moved over from Counter-Strike but maybe aren't actively playing as much anymore. So as we move into Valorant, you can see he's playing a fair bit even in 2020 after, that last season of Contenders that he participates in. He starts playing on Direwolves and Mindfreak, which are some decent teams, top 8 kind of material, and even gets himself a top 4 in First Strike, which is a pretty decent result. As you move into 2021, you see Signed playing for Demon. He scouted from Demon to fill DickStacy, who steps down from Order's position in the Initiator, and he's known as a little bit of a Sova specialist. So under Order, he manages to win both of the off-circuit events. He wins Order Nova Invitational, and he wins Rising Heroes. But unfortunately, this is the period where Order get upset by Wildcard in Stage 2 finals, and I think in both of the series that Order loses to Wildcard, Signed doesn't particularly play super well. I'm not sure how well he fit into the Order team, maybe in terms of, the vibe and the, culture of the team. Not sure what led to his removal after that, but obviously Order dropping the Stage 2 finals is probably going to be a bit of a disappointing result for them. And interestingly enough, he actually ends up joining the Wildcard team that ended up, maybe potentially contributing to his removal. So interesting set of circumstances there. Towards the end of the year, I think Signed, like I said before, is on this wildcard team where I would have expected them to maybe snag one of those NALCQ spots, but doesn't end up eventuating. They get upset back-to-back by Peace. As we head into 2022, as I mentioned before, he's playing for ex-wildcard who get knocked out in the open qualifier. So he is not actually, he's one of the players that's not actually present at all in the Stage 1 event in 2022, just misses out completely, doesn't go and fill for another team. But once Stage 2 rolls around, he's going to link up with the Nozz and a couple of these other players to play for Bobo, which go on to be the second best team in the country for the majority of 2022, just behind Order. So I think Signed, you can see at various points in both his Overwatch career and at various points in his Valorant career, playing for Order, which was the best team in the country, and definitely playing on some dangerous wildcard rosters and Demon, which were considered to be a pretty strong roster in some of these opening, events of the year. He's definitely a player that can say, you could say he's been pretty consistently top 2, even at times top 1 in the region. He's definitely been a very, very strong asset to any team he's a part of because he's been fantastic at being a specialist at that initiator role. He's a great glue guy. He understands a lot of the macro aspects of the game. And as far as I understand it, he might have a little bit of calling potential as well. I think maybe he might have been doing some of the calling for this Bobo team. Not sure who would have done the majority for it between him and Nozz. Maybe it's a bit of a shared system, as it might have been in Wildcard. So if you're looking for someone that's a bit of a glue player, someone that already has previous experience from another esport, Sun might be a decent shout. My only issue is that he has pretty limited international experience compared to some of the other candidates that we've talked about. You're talking about the EXO core, you're talking about the boys who played for Order, even some of the Bonkers guys. I don't really count Red Bull Campus Clutch as being a legit event that counts as much for international experience, because to me that kind of reminds me of some of those WRONSKI events from Counter-Strike, a weird qualification system. And even further on from that, the other thing about Signed is that in some events he doesn't really stand out too well statistically, although a lot of what he contributes to a team is outside of the normal kind of statistics that you expect in terms of ACS. He's more so contributing the macro aspects of the game, good utility, filling a lot of roles that are super important and performing them well. So might be someone that's worth a consideration, but unfortunately doesn't make the top list. So as mentioned at the start, I'm going to go through a bunch of honorable mentions, and these are people that, I wouldn't really expect to see getting picked up for franchising or anything like that, but these are people that I would expect to hopefully get involved in Oceanic Valorant in the future and maybe try to grind their way through the open circuit. These are people that are definitely noteworthy in terms of their achievements in the first couple of years since Valorant came out. So in particular, look, we'll just go through every single one quickly. Autumn, obviously one of the best duelists in the country in the earlier parts of the game, and he was part of a very, very dominant Order roster that had a great string of results for a long time. He even qualified for an overseas event, but unfortunately that was the NALCQ that didn't end up happening, and I would have loved to be able to see what he'd be able to do if he had made it over to that tournament. Because he was definitely someone that a lot of people had an eye on. Unfortunately, in 2022 especially, he didn't find his way onto any of the top teams really. So look, I'm hoping that he's going to stick with it and you'll see more of him next year. Skrawl is a player who I almost feel like, should probably be a player I would love to recommend for franchising. He's someone that I've coached a couple of times. He's very coachable, very receptive, excellent glue guy. Probably at times the best Sova that we had in the region, just in terms of knowledge and in terms of what he was able to contribute to the team. Of course, he went overseas and played in the VCT APAC Stage 1 this year. And he's been part of the Bobo roster, which has been dominant over this year. Additional to that, he was also part of the Mindfreak core, which did kind of push Order a little bit in a couple of finals. So this is a player that would be right up the top of kind of the recommend list. And even right now, or for most of 2022, he has been a player that's been playing on a top roster pretty consistently. So a very, very good player in our region. Next up is SWERL. He's a player that, particularly on the wildcard roster, he impressed me. He was a big contributing factor as to why they were able to win such great series against Order. The issue with SWERL, I feel, has always just been the fact that I don't think he's been super well utilized in a lot of his teams, and he's just always been a little bit of a streaky, inconsistent player. He's not a player that I would necessarily rely on as my main style, but he's a player that if he's like the second, third best player in your team, he's going to bring you pop-off performances. He's someone that's known for his mechanical prowess. His aim is very, very snappy, very, very sharp. You always see a lot of highlight clips from this man, so I'm hoping that he sticks with it. But unfortunately, due to the fact that outside of a team or two, maybe wildcard, he never quite landed on a solid roster and never quite, was well utilized enough in his team. He's kind of bouncing around a bunch of different mixed teams, so never quite got super great results in terms of qualifying for an overseas tournament or anything like that, outside of that really, really good performance in wildcard. I think NiceHacks is someone that He did qualify for VCT Stage 1. He was very consistently in the top of the stats and probably one of the most well-rounded duelist players. When a lot of duelists were pretty much only playing Jet or, Reina or something like that, NiceHacks was a player who, even before Raze was the norm and was the meta, was playing a lot of Raze, was playing whatever duelist his team needed of him. When Neon came out, he was quite happy to pick up the Neon, and that versatility really contributed to Bonkers being able to actually win VOT Stage 1 this year and qualify to the overseas event. But unfortunately, NiceHacks couldn't attend with them. If he had, I think they probably could have even done better at that event, and I think this is a player that it's a very big missed opportunity that we didn't get to go and see what he can do overseas. But I'm hoping he sticks with it, and we'll be able to see him more next year. I think Ciko is a player where, we didn't really see him get many great results in 2022, but obviously he was one of the players who has qualified for an overseas event as well, playing on the Peaks roster, which then got picked up by Chiefs at the end of 21. I think along with WRONSKI and in general a couple of the other players in the team, but particularly Ciko impressed me because he was a player that would play a controller role or initiator role, and he was always delivering a lot of impact and a lot of clutch potential and just giving his team a better ceiling, just due to the fact that he was a player that in a role you wouldn't expect it of him. He would have some pop-off performances and some big clutches that'll be able to put his team across the line. So Dragon is someone that he's been involved in the domestic scene for quite a long time, going back to his days like playing on Nebula and stuff like that. I think this year, end of last year, this year, he's very much come into his own, playing on some better rosters. He's someone that can be quite flexible in terms of the role he plays, but you can see he's played for Bobo in 2022 for the last two stages of the VOT, and they've got second to order both times. But he has, I think at the championship, he might have been the highest rated player overall. We'll just double check that. But definitely in either stage 3 or champs, outside of Watt, who only played 74 rounds, he was the highest rated player with a bit better of a round score there, so a bit bigger of a sample size, even above WRONSKI. So he's had a very, very good tournament at the end of the year there, in arguably like one of the most important tournaments of the year. Dragon has played very, very well, and I think he's someone that you definitely need to keep an eye on into next year if he continues to play. He could probably be the best player on a team that's able to grind through the open circuit and actually does quite well for themselves. I think Lou is worth a mention as well. His teams never necessarily achieved a ton outside of maybe getting themselves like top 4, top 8 kind of results a lot of the time, but he has very consistently been playing Chamber and Jet, one of the top stat and top rated players in a lot of these tournaments. So he's someone that if you need him to output a fair bit of fragging potential on that role, he's someone that can definitely do it. And I'd be keen to see if he sticks with it in the future and continues to deliver that high fragging output that you might need to kind of grind yourself through a domestic tournament. Dutti Boy was kind of a standout because he was one of the top rated players for a number of tournaments in a row. I think in 2022 for the most part. Stage 1, he had a fantastic Stage 1. I think Stage 2, he was one of the highest rated players as well, going from playing with Iconic into playing with Mind Freak later on. So he's someone that he has very, very high fragging output, and I'd be keen to see if he's going to land himself on a good roster next year. I think Norsin, Watt, eezy, and Fweshest, all 4 of these players are players that are worth mentioning because they all played for teams that were able to push order a little bit and that were pretty consistently all kind of top 4 teams. So these are very consistent players that unfortunately never got a big win on the board, never got that big upset that they were looking for, but at times were able to make it into grand finals, make it into very close semi-finals. And I think maybe if they can just land themselves on better teams, or you maybe see them up their game a little bit heading into next year, they might be some of the best players in the country. So Ninim, it's a bit of a mean pick because he doesn't even really play anymore, but it's going back historically through a lot of the stats, just deep diving on some of the other players that I feel like would be better picks for franchising. When this guy was playing very, very well in Oceania domestically, he was an absolute monster. Like, he was the key to this wildcard gaming upsetting order in 2021, down here in Stage 2 and in Rising Heroes. And for a lot of those 2021 events, this guy was just a monster. In terms of the statistics, he was pretty consistently in the top 5, and he was having crazy performances, like plus 24 in a grand final across 3 maps or something like that against the best team in the country. So no idea what this guy's doing, but you know, if he was ever to come back and take Valorant a little bit more seriously, you've already seen the talent from this guy, and he could be someone that could definitely do some damage again. I think last couple of guys are people that have already achieved a lot in their careers, both from Counter-Strike as well as Valorant, and I don't think any of them are really super interested in being active players. I could be wrong about that. You know, maybe you'd have another comeback from tixx or something like that. But at least for these 3 guys, if I was ever going to be, you know, Mr. Moneybags and someone handed me a bunch of, you know, venture capital investment or something, and they said, pick your GM or pick your coach for a team, I would definitely pick one of these 3 guys. So DickStacy is the man who has obviously been standing behind Order for the longest time and used to play on Order. And at the helm, you know, going from launch into Order, he has very consistently been a key factor towards their success. And it's no accident that, you know, all the teams that he's been coaching, all the teams that he's been a part of, even going back to Counter-Strike, have often been at the top of our domestic scene, and even, you know, having gone international and further abroad and represented our country very well. Ferg is someone that, you know, he's a little bit older than a lot of the players, comes from a bit of a different generation from someone from Counter-Strike 1.6, but he has got a very, very good understanding of TAC FPS. He's even got some major experience in 1.6 going back, you know, probably to the Stone Age at this point, but he's someone that I know has coaching experience as well in both Counter-Strike and in Valorant, and I think, you know, if you were going to appoint someone as a GM who you know knows their stuff, has experience in both high-stakes tournaments, going overseas, playing both Counter-Strike and Valorant, this guy's probably one of the best candidates for that. And then finally, tixx. He's another player who is a bit more recently active than some of the other players. He was a big part of Order's success for most of Valorant's life cycle. And he's someone that I've also seen coach in Counter-Strike on and off. He's had a very, very long and successful Counter-Strike career. In fact, at one point, he was probably, I would say, the poster boy of Oceanic Counter-Strike, with all the, you know, sick posters that they always used to use to advertise the IEM Australia events. So he's definitely someone who understands both Counter-Strike and Valorant at a very, very high level. He has coaching experience, he has playing experience, he has experience overseas. He'd be a great person to chuck as a GM or as a coach of some kind. And that'll be it for the videos. So let us know if I missed anyone. I probably did, to be honest. And look, if you disagree with me, or if you have some better ideas about who might deserve a spot overseas to, you know, fly the coop of Oceania, then maybe chuck us a comment and let us know what you think.